My name is Sarah Shipp, and this is Creating Resonance with Thematic Design. My background is in professional theater, so I approach game design from a fine arts as craft perspective. I have about 8 years experience doing theater professionally. I've only been designing board games for about 3 years. But a few things have struck me about how board game designers view design compared to theatrical designers. I feel that starting out, many board game designers view game design as an engineering problem. But I contend that game design isn't engineering, it's architecture. Architecture needs engineering in order to build buildings, but architecture is also art. Game design needs math and probability and a solid technical foundation, but if we stay there, then we will stop developing as a field. We need the language of art to move forward. This is especially true when it comes to designing themes. Yes, I said designing themes. Thematic design is just as much about which thematic details you include as it is about how the mechanics relate to the theme. To that end, I've pulled from classical, Renaissance, and modern thinkers to create a formula for resonance within thematic design. I'm using the term thematic design to indicate that I am designing both the theme and the mechanics. And I use the term resonance to refer to how players respond to the presentation or experience of a design. I don't use the phrase experience design very often because I feel that it isn't specific enough to the aspects of design I'm talking about. You can design for experiences in a themeless abstract game. I have an entire series of blog posts discussing different categories of experience design that I've developed, if you're interested in hearing more about my thoughts on that. But what is resonance? Every designer wants to make a resonant game. It's one of the current buzzwords in the industry used to describe games that really stand out, but it's a term no one can define. Opera singers know that resonance is depth, shape, and clarity of tone. That's also the dictionary definition. To create resonant themes, we have to strive for those qualities in our games as well. Or we could avoid themes that are amorphous, muddy, or shallow. Other terms you may hear when talking about resonance are evocative, sticky, or memorable. I originally stopped my definition of resonance as depth, shape, and clarity of theme, but I think there's a more useful definition for the designer. I'm going to be talking about how to make themes that are more resonant. Mechanics can resonate with players, but only to players who are inside the gaming ecosystem. Nobody outside of gaming knows what a worker placement game is. I personally didn't learn the names of board game mechanics until I started designing, in spite of several years of exposure to hobby games before then. When someone asks what a game is about, we usually respond by telling them the theme. Resonant themes are the best tools we have to pull new players into the hobby. By ignoring certain aspects of thematic design, by not treating theme as a skill that can be learned, you will severely limit your potential audience. When asked, many designers will tell you that resonant games are the ones where the mechanics and theme align. I think that's putting the cart before the horse in terms of a good definition. First, we have to understand what theme is. Theme encompasses the setting, story, and tone of a game. Theme is expressed in a variety of ways in board games: illustration, components, mechanics, narrative description, and flavor text. I'll be referring to these as a game's elements. Elements of a game can be motivated or unmotivated. I'm taking these terms from theatrical lighting design. A motivated element is one that has an in-world explanation for why it exists. Unmotivated elements may not be abstract, but they do not have a clear reason for existing. In theater, light shining through a window is motivated. We imagine the sun causing the light on the stage, whereas if the light suddenly shifts to red, that's unmotivated. We cannot imagine a realistic reason for the light change. Iron ingot components in a game about manufacturing are motivated. whereas the same components are unmotivated in a game about butterflies. The player pieces in Monopoly fall into this category. In spite of their interesting history, they are not motivated by the theme of the game. Unmotivated elements are not inherently bad, but they can make a game feel themeless or like the theme is pasted on. Motivated elements add resonance because they are a form of world building. What you are saying when you include motivated elements is that these things exist in your game world for a reason. Some unmotivated elements are necessary, such as scoring conditions that can't logically arise from the theme. The trick here is balance. There needs to be enough motivated elements to offset the necessity of including elements that aid rules comprehension and gameplay. If you don't find this balance, the game will either be incomprehensible or the theme will feel pasted on. I refer to games where the theme and mechanics mesh well together to produce a complete experience as being thematically well integrated. An element could be motivated and still not be integrated. When this happens, those elements will either feel superfluous or like the theme is pasted on. Each individual card in the hand-building game Fantasy Realms is thematically motivated, but the experience of gameplay lacks a thematic cohesion. Cards go in and out of your hands quickly and for no thematic reason. Once you finish the game, you can describe the world you created, but the focus of the game is on getting the most points, not establishing a believable world. Comparatively, in the deck-building game Star Realms, no relation, each turn visualizes an episode of space commerce and combat and politics. I won't go into all the ways this game works thematically because I'm going to take a close look at some other games, but I would recommend these two games as solid examples of the spectrum of how to implement theme. Both are saturated with motivated elements, but Star Realms has an integrated theme and Fantasy Realms does not. Thematic games don't have to be sprawling epics to be considered thematic. Motivated, integrated themes will feel resonant even in filler-length games. I think we as a hobby are prone to confusing thematic games with games that are narrative-heavy and tell a complete linear story by the time you finish playing. I reject that narrow definition. For me, a thematic game is any game where the players can feel the theme through the gameplay. Let's move on from general principles and look at specific ways to make games more resonant. But first, here's my definition for resonance. Resonance is familiarity plus unexpectedness minus chaff. This is the formula I developed to explain what makes a game resonant. This formula is inspired by concepts from Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die by Shipp and Dan Heath. They developed the success model, which stands for simple, unexpected, concrete, credible emotions and stories. It's a handy mnemonic, but the authors admit it doesn't show the relationship that exists between the traits that they outline. I reworked the model to show the interconnectedness, and I cut out the element credible that is mostly outside the scope of design. Credibility can be built within a piece of entertainment or art by having internal credibility through the use of vivid details supporting the core idea, but I'm proposing that by following my formula for resonance, you will be producing that feeling in players anyway. So this trait would ultimately be redundant. Internal credibility is a product of resonance, not a cause, and external credibility is outside the scope of this discussion. Now let's break down what familiarity plus unexpectedness minus chaff means. Familiarity is a concept that should seem obvious, but it's got a lot going on with it. Familiarity is best described by of course moments. Of course, wheat makes bread, or flour, or charcoal, or cattle. Of course, the ground floor must be built before the second floor. The more the audience already knows, the less you have to teach them, which makes rules intuitive. Familiarity taps into show, don't tell, which is the major axiom of storytelling. You don't have to explain that two factions hate each other if the emotion comes through in your game. Just because you state something in your lore doesn't mean the gameplay will support that story. You have to show players what the world is like through your gameplay. Let's talk about how. Familiarity can be expressed in two ways: through emotions and through story elements. We want players emotionally connected to our games. We want them engaged. A game that touches us emotionally gets talked about more than a game of similar weight that is merely a good puzzle. Essentially, this is the difference between Pandemic and Pandemic Legacy Season 1. Designing for emotions in players who play our games seems like a daunting task, but it's worth striving for. It's a skill you can get better at. When designing for emotions, it is important to remember that everything has emotional content. Game elements can be divided into tangible and non-tangible, or physical and mental. The way physical and visual elements produce emotional responses is the subject of entire fields of design. We are used to the idea that colors can create certain moods, but so can shapes, or textures, rhythms, or sounds. We see this in board games with upgraded components. Players like metal coins because they have a more pleasant emotional response to the weight and texture of metal coins than cardboard chits. A game's tempo can create emotions, spanning the spectrum from methodical to frenzy. How players move their bodies, where they look, what they reach for, what they hold in their hands, all produces emotions in players. Studying areas like product design or visual design, color theory, can increase your awareness of how these types of physical elements can affect players. Think of it as cross-training to improve your design muscles. But don't overlook studying body language of your players. This is a big reason why digital playtesting will never replace in-person playtesting. Board games are physical objects with layers of emotional content. Non-physical elements, such as ideas, also produce emotional responses. Narrative elements, such as settings, stories, or even characters, are capable of producing complex emotional experiences. Just ask anyone who's played time stories. In addition to other narrative elements, strategies, and other elements of emergent gameplay can create emotions in games. I'm not going to touch on strategy here, though, because there are other resources out there that discuss game arcs and player engagement a lot better and more in depth. The point here is that everything produces emotions, and the only emotion we really want to avoid is boredom. Emotions are something to be aware of, and even playtest for, but they can be somewhat ethereal when we are attempting to list design principles. Designing for emotions comes with practice. So let's move on to story elements, which are more concrete and easier to implement into design. In 1570, Lodovico Castelvetro codified what became known as the classical unities of theater: unity of action, unity of place, and unity of time. This meant that the story of a play needed to occur in one location, during one day, and be about one thing. This was supposed to prevent audience confusion about what was taking place on stage. Anyone who has watched Hamilton knows that these unities didn't stick as guiding principles. However, we can use the classical unities as a jumping off point to create, of course, moments in our game stories. The purpose of the classical unities was to make sure that the audience knew what was going on. One of the traits of resonance is clarity. I know I said one of the other traits was depth, but we need to prioritize clarity because players need to be able to see what they are doing clearly before they can appreciate the breadth and scope of your game world. Our players need to know why they are performing the actions of the game. To design a more thematic game, there needs to be unity of action between the mechanics and the theme. I label this as plot. Game objectives should align with the theme, which is to say the plot of your gameplay should align with the plot of your theme. And themes should be complete sentences, not just nouns. Dogs is not a theme. Dogs chasing mail carriers is a theme. Can the dogs work together to protect their house from trespassing mail carriers? That's a resonant theme. Themes should have verbs. Verbs indicate actions. Themes without verbs almost always feel pasted on. Themes should be able to be stated as questions, because the outcome of a game is not predetermined the way the end of a novel is. Make sure how you win the game is the crux of your theme. If a game claims to be about conservation, but the main mechanic is cutting down trees to build lumber mills, the theme is not in line with the objective. Every action a player takes should further the narrative arc. Or to put it another way, the actions taken in the game are the story, and the theme should match the action. Don't claim your plot is something other than what is present in the gameplay. One way to achieve this is to try to incorporate as many evocative actions as possible. Evocative actions are game actions that use thematic words as the names of the actions. They evoke the theme. So you build a house instead of placing a piece. There is a balance here with rules comprehension, but when done well, evocative actions will actually make your rules easier to learn. Yes, these are all technically ways to create mechanic-theme alignment, but this is a more detailed, story-focused perspective. This is the process of thematic integration. Well, there's more, but we're getting to it. Since we're discussing plot, I want to address fluff, which is the term I use for flavor text and lore that is not required reading in order to play the game. My particular concern here is the fluff found on the first page of the rulebook. Introductory world-building fluff at the beginning of a rulebook, ideally, should lead into gameplay by explaining why characters are in the position that they are in on the first turn of the game, because the goal of every thematic detail in the box should be clarity. Use the lore paragraph before setup to create incentive to play the game, to find out more about the world. Including too many thematic details when players are trying to internalize rules can contribute to information overload. This is where unity of action really comes in. I've read a number of rule books where the lore fluff didn't seem to have anything to do with the actual game. This paragraph or two is an opportunity to set the stage and establish the tone for the actual game. Don't waste that opportunity by trying to cram in all the world building you possibly can. There are places for your world building, but the page before setup isn't one of them. Now let's turn to unity of place, which I call location. Location isn't just setting. It's also world physics and character physics. Setting is where an event takes place. World physics is the manifestation of the rules of that world, such as gravity, propulsion, heat, or visibility. Character physics usually manifests as direction of movement and speed, but it could also be inventory size, strength, need to eat, etc. I include character physics and location because all game physics helps establish the rules and feel of your world. Location can be expressed through illustration, components, and mechanics. The conveyor belts in Sushi Roll are such a small addition, but they do so much to add sense of place. In Sushi Go, players collect sushi to form their meals, but they seem to do so in a void. By that I mean there is no indication in the game where the players are when they are collecting sushi. The only sense of location is the chopsticks, which reminds us that we're not eating with our hands. Not only are the conveyor belt tiles in Sushi Roll useful mechanically, but they go a long way to evoking location. we are in a conveyor belt sushi restaurant. That's a way cooler place to be than a void. The building rules in Walking in Verano are one example of how using recognizable physics can help teach the rules of the game. In Verano, players are constructing buildings one floor at a time, but must build from the ground up unless they use scaffolding as a temporary floor. It seems like such a little thing, but a board game that acknowledges gravity clearly sets that game in a world that is comprehensible to the players. And because the world is comprehensible, the rules are easier to remember. I may be alone in this, but I'm a big fan of the rondel mechanic in Scorpius Freighter. The action locations are visited by ships that are slowly orbiting planets. This mechanic ties the circular rondel shape to orbits, and the limited movement per turn evokes the vastness of space, whether or not actual orbits would be that slow. Location is about creating a sense of reality through game elements. As humans, we can relate to physics that matches what we see in the real world. However, I'm not saying that the physics in the game needs to be scientifically rigorous, merely something logical to players. But the pagoda in Four Gardens doesn't create a sense of location because its physics are not analogous to the real world. Even skyscrapers with spinning restaurants only spin part of the building and only one way. There's nothing in the physics of Four Gardens pagoda that evokes the real world. Just being a pagoda is setting, it's not world physics. However, that doesn't mean Four Gardens isn't resonant at all. But it does mean that it's not using world physics to build on resonance. More on that later. The next story element is time. I don't view time exactly the way unity of time works in theater. Games don't have to tell linear stories in order to be understandable by players. Time behaves differently in games than in linear entertainment. This is because perception of time passing has a lot to do with how a player feels while playing a game. Time is about pacing and rhythm and scale, not about game length or linear narrative. How we theme our games should be informed by the pace of the gameplay. Game progress should align with the amount of time represented by the game's theme. Civ games tend to be slow because accumulating that much history is slow. Some themes need to feel pressed for time. Bomb defusal games should avoid analysis paralysis, for instance. Turn length, round length, and scoring style affect the pacing of the game, but a player's physical movement and handling of game components can also contribute to the perception of timescale in a game. An exciting game with a short round structure can actually feel like a shorter game than it actually is. A thinky game will feel slow, even if the game isn't very long. Combining time and location, I use the phrase "find the movement" as a great place to start when re-theming a game. Start with what the game feels like, its rhythm, how things move, and build the theme from there. I do this because the pace and physics of a game are what will contribute most to a feeling of verisimilitude between the theme and the mechanics. This method is harder than just picking a cool sounding theme, but it yields better results. Alternatively, be prepared to change your mechanics to match your theme. I add to Castle Vestro's list of plot, location, and time, character. I think of player characters more like miniature plots unto themselves. I separate character from plot because in storytelling, characters are often at odds with the overall plot. Characters have desires, faults, and ideals. So this category is more about a character's goals than about their physical traits, which I place in location. Characters' in-world desires should match their mechanical goals. In good fiction writing, characters have goals and obstacles to those goals. Good game design works the same way, so it only makes sense to have a character's deepest desires line up with their win condition. Root does this surprisingly well, in that the mechanics and win condition of the different factions are expressed so much about the socio-political environment of that world. Individual characters are easier to identify with, and thus more empathetic, than faceless collectives like factions or corporations. Humans are also more empathetic than aliens. Remember, the goal is to create an emotional response in players, and one way to do that is empathy. We like what we can relate to. One concrete element that can add a lot of emotion to a theme is relationships. This doesn't have to be fully developed fog of love style relationships. Two brothers raising armies and going to war is a better story than two factions going to war. I experienced this with my first signed game. I started with a game about how the aristocracy built generational wealth, but I felt the theme didn't resonate well. It didn't resonate as well as I wanted. I didn't really care about money being passed on generationally from father to son. I wanted players to play as a single person they could identify with. However, a single person receiving inheritance from multiple sources becomes increasingly implausible with each inheritance. I wanted a stronger sense of relationship than that would raise the emotional stakes of the theme. So I changed the theme to Victorian women killing their husbands for inheritance money and called it Deadly Dowagers. In addition to only playing a single character, the retheme adds relationships between the player characters and the NPCs. Admittedly, this may not be a theme that pulls everyone in, but it is memorable, evocative, and resonant. Familiarity isn't enough to make a game stand out. Unexpectedness adds spice to familiarity. Unexpected elements grab attention and generate interest through breaks in a pattern. However, this requires that you establish a pattern before you can break it. If everything is unexpected, nothing is. Unexpectedness can occur thematically as whimsy, fantastical elements that depart from reality, as reversals or flipped tropes, as uniqueness and innovation, or as high production values. But again, once everyone has games with miniatures or the latest hotness, that ceases to be a draw for any particular game. The trick to adding unexpected elements is to keep them unexpected. I explain whimsy as the defining aesthetic of a Miyazaki film. In design language, fantasy means images and themes that depict things that could never exist in reality. More along the lines of the flying whales from Fantasia 2000 and less medieval wizards, if that makes sense. Whimsy is the inclusion of fantasy elements with possibly a lighter touch. This is where Four Gardens fits thematically for me. A 3D rotating tower of resources is whimsical and creates the unexpectedness needed for resonance. Reversals take familiar storylines and flip the script. This is an easy unexpectedness hack, but not everything is made better by using a reversal. The story you tell still needs to feel motivated by the actions and needs to create the proper emotional responses in players in order to feel thematic. Trope subversion doesn't have to be a complete reversal, however. Subverting expectations can be a powerful storytelling method and resonance generator. Reversals or subversions can create feelings of imbalance in players that can draw them into a game emotionally because they no longer know what to expect. While we're talking about tropes, reversals are a good way to avoid stereotypes. However, regardless of whether an element is presented as true to type or as a subversion, we should take care to present our themes in a manner that is well thought out and respectful. I find that most harmful stereotypes appear in designs in which the designer simply didn't care enough to put in the work to make the theme more vibrant and respectful. I hope that one takeaway from this panel is that good themes don't just happen, they take work. Innovation or other forms of uniqueness will always create excitement. But just like production values, there's a limit to how far uniqueness can take you. Innovation generally will lead to more critical acclaim than commercial appeal. And uniqueness is difficult to set as a design goal. While it's great to stumble into genuine innovation, high-quality iteration is easier to plan for and to achieve. And by making a really resonant game, you can make a game that feels innovative, even if the concept is a rehash of something else. A lot of games rely on production values to generate excitement. Previously, production values were a type of uniqueness. I'm a proponent of good-looking, high-quality games. But as high production values become commonplace and expected, they will no longer be able to be relied upon to single-handedly generate interest in a game. In other words, production values can still provide a hit of uniqueness, but the jury's out on how much longer that will remain true. Also, as a designer, production values are typically outside of my control, as I don't plan to ever self-publish. There are trends within product design, There are trends within the product design of a game to try to generate interest. Miniatures, custom-shaped or screen-printed meeples, scenario books that replace boards, apps, etc. One that I find interesting is verticality, the implementation of components that make significant use of the y-axis. I find verticality interesting because some designs seem to include it only to increase table presence and don't connect it to gameplay, which is not very resonant. Speaking of table presence, let's talk about gimmicks. Gimmicks rely on big, splashy elements to grab attention. Anything that does that can feel gimmicky. Instead, we need to be asking interesting questions of our design. What component would most help drive home the theme? What would make players care more about the characters or story in the game? How can I subvert expectations? I particularly like trope flipping because it requires a minimal amount of effort to achieve results. Theme-forward techniques like that don't increase the cost of the game in the way adding miniatures does is a low-impact way to get a lot of results. It's cheaper. Asking questions of your design requires you to engage with your theme. Never, ever, ever expect your audience to do the imaginative work that you were unwilling to do. I don't mean that you have to spell everything out for your players. I mean that you need to critically examine your theme to see where engagement or interest could be added. Engage your theme and interrogate it. You'll be surprised where you end up. When you know what your theme is, its plot, location, rhythm, characters, and twist, cut everything else out. Do as little as possible to build the world beyond what is represented by the game. Figure out the core of the theme and get rid of everything else. Try to always leave your players wanting more. That feeling will drive engagement more than extensive world building will. Feel free to write a novel about your world, but don't put it in the game box. However, putting a limit on the amount of detail expressed in your theme is not licensed to skimp on research. Really good research will inform which details are most necessary and evocative. The components ought to be so firmly compacted that if any one of them is shifted to another place, the whole is loosened up and dislocated. For an element whose addition or subtraction makes no perceptible difference is not really a part of the whole. This is my favorite quote about board game design, even though it's actually about theatrical design. Many people have said similar things throughout history, but not only did Aristotle say it first, he said it best. Side note, the classical unities come from the neoclassical era, but they were an attempt to build on Aristotle's rules for theater. Theater history has a lot of good advice for board game design. Good design is about removing clutter. Every detail of your game should reinforce the core theme. Just because a detail fits into your world doesn't mean it belongs in the game. If you really must add details, I do recommend using illustration as a way to convey details that doesn't impede gameplay. Including a detail because it's cool will feel gimmicky because it is a gimmick. I define a gimmick as anything that brings a sense of novelty and appeal and not much else. If you are including an unnecessary element that you don't think is cool, why are you doing that? Don't do that. A gimmick looks cool, but either it isn't functional or it impedes usability. A gimmick adds more cost than value of what is received. Every element should feel necessary to the game experience. Anything else is a distraction. Your core theme will create your core emotional experience. Adding extraneous elements dilutes the emotional experience. In other words, too much fluff makes your game less resonant. But there is a compromise here. I like to think of flavor text and certain other thematic details as opt-in details, meaning a player can choose to ignore these details if they want. Flavor text is usually in a small font at the bottom of a card. I have the choice to read it or not. Components, even card art, don't give me that option. I can't opt out. They're too prominent for my eyes to skip over. That's the reason I get frustrated by the lore at the beginning of rulebooks. I can't tell straight away if it contains important information about the game or not. If you want to include extra detail in your game that provides only flavor, it needs to be the kind of detail players can choose to opt into or not. Removing chaff is also about finding the proportion between the familiar and the unexpected. Too much unexpectedness is jarring and will disconnect players from the theme. Too much familiarity only becomes a problem when the details stray from the core theme. So generally speaking, leave unexpectedness to a few surprising twists compared to the rest of the game. Now I'd like to look at two games as case studies to see how they implement the traits I've outlined. The first is Tokaido. Let's start with the rules lore to see what the game says about itself. The players are travelers into Japan in the days of old. They will follow the prestigious Tokaido and try to make this journey as rich an experience as possible. To do this, they will pass through magnificent countrysides, taste delicious culinary specialties, purchase souvenirs, and benefit from the virtues of hot springs, and have unforgettable encounters. Or as most gamers have described the game, you're competing to have the best vacation. I like the brevity here. There's additional historical information at the end of the rulebook, but the introduction only tells you what you need to know to get into the game. It's not amazing writing, but it gets the job done. The board itself is fairly abstract, but we still see a road clearly stretching across it, with wayside points to stop at. In this case, the suggestion of a road is just as effective as a more realistic illustration. After all, the character movement reinforces the idea of a road, as does the elongated shape of the board. Without these signifiers, however, the abstract representation would not have been as effective. Tokaido is a masterclass of evocative actions. Let's look at the action names in the game. Well, first, a player moves a traveler and lands on a space. I'd prefer if the player traveled to a location and visited or stopped there, but we can't have everything. However, each of the spaces is evocative in a way that aids rules comprehension. Shops sell souvenirs, temples accept donations, encounters reveal people, inns provide meals. Ending a round or day with essentially dinner is particularly evocative. The remaining locations require a small amount of imagination, but we can assume that farms produce money because you spend time there as a day laborer. Panoramic views appear to produce panoramic artwork. The location and the cards are just called panorama, which is a touch confusing. And hot springs presumably produce relaxation. Nowhere on the board is there a generic board game symbol to draw a card. The thematic graphic design is effective at reinforcing the rules while also helping reduce the abstraction of the board, particularly the road. Tokaido deftly uses time and location elements to create the feel of gameplay without needing full bleed art on the game board. This is good news for game designers. You can create rich experiences in your prototypes, even if you aren't an artist. The cards do have generic game graphics on them in the form of scoring tables and transformation arrows. However, the larger art of these cards, as opposed to the locations on the board, offsets the necessity of this information. There is a balance struck between thematic expression and usability. We find plenty of familiarity in shopping, sightseeing, stopping at an inn for the night. The unexpectedness of Tokaido comes from the clean visual design of the board, coupled with the thematic gameplay. That same clean design keeps the game feeling uncluttered. It's a rare feat in a point salad style game. It's also still unexpected almost a decade later. For the next case study, I'll be looking at a much more detail-filled game, Everdell. Once again, let's start with the lore in the rulebook. A new year begins. Within the charming valley of Everdell, beneath the boughs of towering trees, among meandering streams and mossy hollows, a civilization of forest critters is thriving and expanding. Ever since the famed adventurer Corin Evertail discovered the hidden realm long ago, the citizens have prospered under the shelter of the Evertree. From Everfrost to Bellsong, many a year have come and gone, but the time has come for new territories to be settled and new cities established. You will be the leader of a group of critters intent on just such a task. There are buildings to construct, lively characters to meet, events to host. It will be a busy year. Will the sun shine brightest on your city before the winter moon rises? It's not great. There are too many details in general, but also too many details that only exist in the rulebook and that don't appear in the game. This is a game with a lot of flavor text, both on the cards and in the rulebook, including a short story and a poem, in addition to this intro fluff. But most of that text is very clearly opt-in lore. The beginning of the rulebook is a place most players don't want to dwell on. Lengthy fluff like this with lots of adjectives and place names feels like a loss of momentum before the game has even begun. I would prefer something more like this. Within the charming... A new year begins. Within the charming valley of Everdell, a civilization of forest critters is thriving and expanding. But the time has come for new territories to be settled and new cities established. You will be a leader of a group of critters intent on just such a task. There are buildings to construct, lively characters to meet, events to host. It will be a busy year. Will the sun shine brightest on your city before the winter moon rises? The focus changes from what the players will be doing in the game to what the players will be doing in the game, not the geography and history of the world. Now, don't get me wrong. This is perhaps my biggest criticism of Everdell's expression of theme, and it's one that's shared by many games. One lesson here is to read your lore fluff out loud to see if you're giving the reader too much detail. Let's move on. The art of Everdell is highly evocative. Reminiscent of other works such as The Wind in the Willows or the Redwall series, the art immediately establishes the tone of the game. Cozy, but not completely free from conflict. The resources in Everdell are delightfully tactile. The berries, which are made of a squishy plastic, are a standout example of how materials used in components can create resonance. The rest of the resources are nearly as good. The resin is translucent, the pebbles are opaque hard plastic, the twigs are made out of wood. Tactility that matches our expectations provides a strong emotional response. Tactility can also be an avenue of unexpectedness. I'm not sure that I can name another game that uses the same kind of squishy plastic as the berries in Everdell. The building cards produce resources or effects that are highly thematic. Mines produce pebbles, farms produce berries, storehouses store resources. Buildings also attract critters whose profession matches the building. Postal pigeons move into post offices. Kings move into castles. Placing a closed-door token on a building that has already attracted a critter is a simple and thematic reminder that that building is occupied. We get a sense of location from the materials used to build the buildings, from how the buildings are used, and from the critters that inhabit the buildings. Coupled with the game board, Everdell has a strong sense of place. One small element of dissonance is that the positioning in your tableau has no game effect. Now, I'm far from wanting Everdell to be more complicated, but I wish that neighboring buildings or critters had some slight mechanical relationship rather than just being a random assortment in front of the player. While discussing location, we have to talk about the tree. The tree adds a sense of scale to a world relative to the wooden critter workers. It also adds unexpectedness through sheer verticality. It makes an attempt to be incorporated into the game board as a place to store components, which ultimately isn't that useful, but I would rather have it have some use than for it to just be a cardboard sculpture. The tree impairs usability slightly by blocking lines of sight during gameplay, and when it's awkward when storing it outside of the game. But I suppose the lesson here is that if you are going to include an element that is even slightly difficult to use, it had better be gorgeous and highly thematic to offset its potential downsides. Everdell is not the only game to divide rounds into phases or seasons, but it uses this structure pretty well to create a sense of time passing. Players can imagine harvests, births, and rests after long journeys during the prepare for season phase. My only complaint here is that the theming is so strong that it conflicts with the rules. One player can move into a new season while the other players are still in the previous season, which is so counterintuitive that I got this rule wrong the first time I played Everdell. Everdell uses illustration, tactility, and verticality and timing to create a rich world while mostly not overcluttering this world with distracting details. These were just two examples that use a variety of tools to create resonance, particularly with regards to location and time. I hope to see more games in the future that leverage character motivation and relationships for resonance, especially in shorter games. Campaign and legacy games are already exploring more complex characterizations. I hope that you leave today with a better sense of what it means for a game to be resonant. To recap, resonance is a combination of emotions and story elements with some attention-grabbing twists that focuses on the core experience and nothing else. Familiarity plus unexpectedness minus chaff. If you want to dig into more thematic design concepts, I have a blog at shipboardgames.blogspot.com, which updates most Mondays. Thank you.